Hi everyone, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to come to my talk. I'm excited to present to you my research on applications of satellite and airborne remote sensing to grazing land classifications. So much of the research or in the work done in the agroecology lab at Archbold has centered around researching sustainable practices in grazing lands and balancing the trade-offs of different land management regimes. And knowing that grazing lands are one of the key components to protecting Florida wildlife and conservation has resulted in a strong research focus on this topic at the station and at Buck Island Ranch. So this research is super important for two main reasons. The first being that ranching can be used as a method for conservation of native habitat and preservation of biodiversity in Florida under the pressure of urban intensification. And the second being that this research informs best practices for cattle ranchers in terms of water quality and land management. So in Florida, there are three major grazing land management regimes. The first being native pastures. These are exactly what they sound like. They're mostly undisturbed and unfertilized swaths of land and have high biodiversity values. The second land management regime is semi-native pastures. These are made up of a combination of native species and Bahia grass. Bahia grass is a commonly planted forage option on ranches as it's extremely palatable and popular forage options for cattle. The third regime is improved pastures. These pastures are dominated by Bahia grass. They're basically totally homogeneous and they have legacy of phosphorus fertilization, and are still fertilized with nitrogen, although they're not as heavily fertilized as other row crops. So you can see on the spectrum that there are trade-offs that come with these different management schemes. At the native end, biodiversity is high and wildlife is largely conserved, but cattle yields will be lower in comparison to improved pastures at the other end of the management spectrum. And although highly managed for cattle production, improved pastures, they do actually have conservation value as they provide habitat for some grassland birds. Yet as they have homogeneous species composition, they do have lower diversity values, biodiversity values. This results in a dichotomy of needing to balance ecological needs with economical needs and is the center of focus for much of the work in the agroecology lab here. This is a map of Buck Island Ranch where the agroecology lab is based and was the main site for my research. So Buck Island Ranch is a 10,500 acre ranch and has been used by Archbold as a model system for researching sustainable agricultural practices, ranching, water management, and more for the past 30 years. Buck Island Ranch is made up of two pasture types: improved pastures, which are shown in green on this map, and semi-native pastures, which are shown in red. It is important to note that Buck Island Ranch does not have native pastures. So the mapping and classification systems that I'm going to talk about today do not include native pastures, but native pastures do need to be included when scaled up to larger areas. For my project, I decided that I wanted to focus on using my skills in remote sensing and computation to address the problem of not having a method for the mapping of high resolution land classifications in grazing lands. So at the state scale, the Florida Natural Areas Inventory, which I'll call FNAI from now on, creates land cover maps. And you can see in the image on the left, which is the FNAI map, that most of Buck Island Ranch is shaded in gray. And this is because the FNAI classification map classifies most of Buck Island as improved pastures. But everyone who works on the ranch knows that this is absolutely not the case. And even on Buck Island Ranch, we have a map, which you can see on the right. I've already introduced it to you. This is supposed to be one of the most accurate maps of the ranch, but it often heavily contrasts the actual land composition. And so we're interested in using a better map for land composition on the ranch because we want to know how representative Buck Island Ranch is in comparison to other grazing lands. Because if it is representative, it can be used to scale up to larger areas. So it's been challenging to address questions like this because the differences in vegetation composition are heterogeneous and they're small, which makes them difficult to quantify using traditional field studies. So we need enormous amounts of data to grasp the complexity of the system. And working with large amounts of data can be super difficult because you have to grapple with the limitations of technology and you have to use complex computation. This is generally known and referred to as a big data problem. So one way to solve this big data problem, and the route I took was by using high resolution satellite and airborne remote sensing combined with the Google Earth Engine platform for high throughput and distributed computing. For this project, I chose to classify Buck Island Ranch in the context of 4 major land classes or categories. The first 2 classes are semi-native and improved pastures, which we've already been introduced to in the map of Buck Island Ranch in the red and green areas. And the last 2 are wetlands and tree classifications, which are included because they're dominant components of land cover on Buck Island Ranch. And this is a simplified visual representation of how satellite and airborne remote sensing works. So the sun emits, very briefly, the sun emits solar electromagnetic radiation, and this radiation is absorbed and reflected by the Earth's surface at different levels based on the composition of the object or land type that the electromagnetic radiation reaches. The reflected solar radiation from the Earth is then read by satellites or sensors on planes or drones, and then converted into spectral reflectance data for visible and non-visible wavelengths. This data is then sent down to ground receivers where they're processed for analysis like what I'm about to show you today. And as I said before, Google Earth Engine was my data processing platform. Google Earth Engine is becoming a standard platform because it's most importantly open access, but it also has over a petabyte of pre-imported data, which cuts out a lot of extra work and time that goes into remote sensing. So it's really efficient. It also uses the Google server. So all of the image processing, even on massive scales like global scales, is done at incredibly fast speeds. This is a general reflectance spectra for living vegetation. Circled here is a relatively high reflectance in the visible wavelengths, red, green, blue, what we see with our eyes, due to chlorophyll in plants. The chlorophyll reflectance is responsible for plants showing up as green to the human eye. So just to emphasize this small hump at around 0.6 microns is why we see plants as green. Next, note on the spectral curve that the near infrared reflectance is much higher than the red reflectance of plants. This is a consistent feature of green vegetation all across the world. This trait of high near infrared reflectance has been exploited as a method for vegetation identification. For example, this is a Landsat 5 tile of an agricultural field in southern Kansas, just a random place. Landsat 5 provides us with imagery of the Earth at a high resolution of 30 meter pixels. And the red box is an unvegetated field. And you can see that on the left, our eyes see it as dirt, brown. And on the right, you can see that it shows up darkly colored due to its low near infrared reflectance. Here's another example. This new area marked in the red box is a vegetated field. This shows up as green on the left to our eyes. And to the right, it shows up as a brightly colored box due to its high near infrared reflectance. And the reason why I'm telling you all of this is because all living vegetation are similar in that they have the same general shape for their reflectance spectrums, but due to physiological differences, species have small variations in their spectral curves, as you can see in an example right here. I used these small differences and I exploited them by using machine learning to create a mapping system for Buck Island Ranch. Now, the question that I want to address using these small differences is, which machine learning technique will yield the most accurate results when classifying the land cover of Buck Island Ranch? I used 3 different machine learning techniques and evaluated which were most effective. The first was the classification and regression tree classifier, which I will call the CART classifier from now on. The second was the support vector machine, or SVM. And the third was the random forest training technique. I'm going to give a very brief overview of how these 3 techniques work with simplified explanations, so just bear with me for 1 second. The first method is known as the CART classifier. This model is a binary decision tree, and it uses maximum likelihood probabilities to create splitting events for variables. So you can see in the example here that the CART classifier is being used to predict whether a person is a male or a female based on their heights and their weights. It's a pretty simple model and it won't always be correct, but it can serve as a strong predictor while still being relatively incomplex. The second is the support vector machine, or SVM. The SVM is known for creating boundaries between classes and using the data that lies closest to the boundary hyperplanes to advise the predictive modeling. This method is used to create the strongest boundaries possible between classes and minimize misclassifications. The third technique is the random forest approach. The random forest approach operates like the CART classifier, but it simulates multiple regression trees and creates a strong prediction by raising sample size through these simulations. So I hypothesized that the random forest approach would be the most successful technique for classifying Buck Island Ranch. And I believe that this would occur because I think that there might be high variability on the ranch in terms of pasture spectra, and that the boundaries between pasture spectra might not be clear enough for the support vector machine to be a better predictor. I also believe that the large sample size would be beneficial to the modeling. And these are the data sets I use for my training algorithms. So I used 3 years from the Landsat Satellite Archive and 4 years from the National Agricultural Imagery Project, which I'll call NAIP from now on. And they're all from 2010 or sooner, all of the data. I use these two data forms because I like that they had trade-offs in spatial resolution, temporal availability, and band range. The Landsat has high temporal availability, meaning that there are lots of images to work with 16-day repeat coverage. And it has a high band range, meaning that the data is more spectrally in depth. But its resolution is 30 meters. And 30 meters is considered pretty high at a global scale, but for Buck Island Ranch, it could be considered a bit low, just because it's a small area. The NAIP data has incredibly high spatial resolution of 1 meter, but low temporal availability and low band range, and it's only reaching the near infrared range. I believe that putting these two data sets together would create a strong predictive data set. The image to the right also shows a sample of code that I wrote to train the Landsat and NAIP data. This project was really highly intensive in terms of computation, so my main time investment was basically experimenting in Google Earth Engine repeatedly for months. And this is a visual representation of the difference in spatial resolutions between Landsat and NAIP data sets. This is Buck Island Ranch. The NAIP appears to be much clearer than the Landsat to our eyes because it's recording data at a finer scale than the Landsat. This is because the NAIP is taken from airborne devices such as planes or drones, which are closer to the Earth's surface. So it's easier to have high resolution than with a satellite. Although some new satellite products are actually starting to have incredibly high resolution as well. But like I already said, the drawback of NAIP data is that it is only collected every few years. So in reality, the pre-processing of the Landsat and NAIP data before using the machine learning techniques was pretty complex, as I had to distill hundreds of thousands of data points down to metrics that were useful for this project. But I'm going to keep this as brief and as simple as possible for now. So for the Landsat record, I filtered out all the images taken at Buck Island Ranch from 2010, 2015, and 2018. I then applied filters for clouds, and I then used a popular vegetation index known as the Normalized Difference of Vegetation Index to convert all the images within each annual band to measures of vegetation cover. The NDVI, which is it's a short form of Normalized Difference Vegetation Index. It exploits the differences between the red and near infrared bands in vegetation to create an index from -1 to 1 to describe how vegetated a pixel is. So 1 is the absolute highest density possible of vegetation, and 0 to -1 is basically describing something that is unvegetated. And I used the NDVI data to create single annual composite images that were representative of maximum vegetation cover for each year. So for each year, 2010, 2015, 2018, I had one Landsat composite representative of the annual maximum vegetation. And once again, this is a pretty complex process. So if you have more questions, I can expand on this later. The NAIP images were already pre-processed for cloud cover, and since they were only observations once every few years, I could just use all of the raw data as long as it had the bands and the visible wavelengths and the near infrared wavelengths, which we had for 2010, 2013, 2015, and 2017. I then combined all the bands from each Landsat and NAIP imagery years to make a single image with 40 layers of data to train the classifications. To select training data for the classifications, Dr. Botten was able to help me and direct me to exact geographical coordinates of around 150 points for each class. Here are points for native, improved, and semi-native all around Florida, but trees and wetlands were also included. And it is also important to note that most of the training points were clustered around Buck Island Ranch for semi-native and improved pastures. So after I trained the 3 different machine learning techniques, I had 3 different maps, all with small variations between each other. The blue areas are representative of wetlands and water. Green is representative of tree cover. The yellow represents improved pastures, and the orange is semi-native pastures. And to evaluate which machine learning technique was the best, I had to perform a field accuracy assessment where I went into the field and ground truthed 100 random points around Buck Island Ranch, with 40 points in improved pastures, 40 points in semi-native pasture classes, and 10 in each for wetlands and tree classifications. So 40 for each of the classifications, 40 and 10, yeah. I then created, when I had the data, I created a confusion matrix for each training technique, which you can see in the top left. The boxes highlighted in blue are representative of how many points were correctly classified for each machine learning technique. The CART classifier reported an overall accuracy of 85%, meaning that the numbers in the blue boxes total to 85 out of the 100 possible points. The SVM reported an overall accuracy of 92%, which I actually found to be pretty surprising because I explained before that I thought the boundaries would be difficult to draw on Buck Island Ranch because I predicted high variability. And then the random forest approach had an accuracy of 90%, which is also pretty high. I was then able to calculate the land cover percentages for each pasture type on Buck Island Ranch based on the map to the right. So this allowed us to potentially identify Bahia grass in pastures that were classified on the Buck Island Ranch as semi-native pastures. So yeah, because we know that some semi-natives are actually more altered than others. And so this is a step forward in mapping vegetation on Buck Island Ranch. And it also allowed for the potential mapping of semi-native vegetation like smut grass and improved pastures. So in conclusion, the support vector machine was the best overall predictor for mapping the 4 different land classifications on Buck Island Ranch. And on top of this finding, all 3 of the machine learning classification methods showed promising results, which is suggesting that the data that we used to train the algorithms were of extremely high quality, which is good to know. We are able to work our way from a low resolution state map, which classifies Buck Island Ranch basically as all improved pastures, to a better Archbold map that breaks down general improved versus semi-native pastures, to an ultra high resolution map of Buck Island Ranch that shows where semi-native or where pastures that are thought to be semi-native are also having Bahia grass and vice versa. This methodology can actually be used to scale up from the ranch to create a comprehensive land use map of larger areas in South Central Florida if we grapple with the computation a little bit more. This is a classification I tried on the headwaters of the Everglades region. This is an extra class. There's an extra class here representing native pastures shown in red. It is not accurate because complexity multiplies as we scale up, but I strongly believe that this is possible to accurately map with time. So to conclude, we started with the problem that quantifying differences in the land surface is difficult because it requires massive amounts of data working at large spatial scales. And today, I hope that I've demonstrated to you that you can do this using remote sensing if you're willing to grapple with the computational challenges that come with it. And lastly, I would like to acknowledge a few people who were fundamental to my success with this project. First, I'd like to thank my PI, Dr. Betsy Botten, who was incredibly supportive overall and was critical to acquiring accurate training data. Secondly, I'd like to thank Shu Kai for advising me with this project and always being there as a fellow remote sensing guru to bounce ideas off of. Additionally, Vivian Slater was so crucial to my ability to complete this project as she helped me on the data system sides. And I'd like to thank the entire agroecology lab for supporting me. And thank you to LTAR for funding my internship. And thank you to all my friends and family and the whole Archbold community for listening to my presentation. Thanks, guys.
Great job, Anna. Thank you.
Thanks.
There are a couple questions in the Q&A, so I'll just read them to you and then you can answer. So first question from Dr. Eric Menges. What methods were used to originally map the vegetation types at BIR? I don't know if you know this one.
What like to distinguish between the pastures and the red and green map?
Yes.
I don't know. I think probably something in the past. I bet you know the answer.
Yes, to my knowledge. So we've always wanted to make a vegetation map of Buck Island Ranch more, smaller scale. But what the current map is that Anna showed with the 2 pasture types, that's based on knowledge of land management at the ranch and our knowledge of where fertilizer was applied in the past, because that fertilizer application is a big way we define the 2 pasture types. Improved has a legacy of phosphorus fertilizer and has nitrogen occasionally, and semi-native pastures, to our knowledge, have never been fertilized. So that, combined with sort of just our field observations, has been how that map was created. And then for the wetlands, we did actually have some Marina Morales and Roberta Pickert went out and ground truthed a bunch of wetlands. So they put a lot of effort into the wetland shapefile at the ranch. Okay, a bunch of other questions popping up. From Elena Roberts, really interesting, Anna, well done. Aside from your field observations, were true values in your training set also from field observations? If not, where did you gather your true values in your training set?
Yeah, so thanks, Elena, for that question. The true values for the training data set were actually given to me by Betsy. Betsy has like incredible knowledge of like exactly what vegetation compositions are like across like multiple regions in Florida. So she was able to give me like exact coordinates for just certain, like she was basically able to tell me like this coordinate is 100% an improved pasture. This is 100% semi-native vegetation. So that's how we did it.
Right, from Hillary, can you talk about how much smut grass is conflating the amount of semi-native that was classified in improved pastures? Do you think you can get a remote sensing signal for smut grass?
Yeah, I actually do think we can get, I don't know the exact like metrics, but I do think we can get a remote sensing metric for smut grass, especially using the super high resolution NAIP data, because when I was out in fields that were like classified as improved, there were definitely areas where they were inundated with smut grass and they were showing up as semi-native. So it was a pretty good indication of where smut grass was, especially if I can go back, especially in the tropical neck of Buck Island Ranch, the very top part. There's a lot of smut grass around this area, and I had a few points to go there.
Here's another interesting question from Kim Ponzio. Have you considered using texture metrics in these analysis in addition to the spectral metrics?
I'm not exactly sure how to answer that. I mean, I thought about using elevation data, but um, I didn't really think about using other metrics because I was honestly super impressed with how the how well the metrics did on their own, to be honest. Um, but it could be interesting to try.
Okay. Here's another question. Can you draw the ranch on your last map so we can see the scale? I think that's talking about the watershed map.
Oh wow. The the ranch would be like right in it would be like a dot in here. Like it's really small on this map. For whoever wants to know the answer to that, I can like show you a better picture later. But it's small. It's like a pixel almost.
Okay, and one last question before we move on. Did you consider using Worldview 2 or 3 imagery instead of Landsat?
I didn't, but there were a lot of options for imagery that I could use. I honestly used Landsat because in my undergraduate career, I became extremely familiar with the Landsat satellite record as I did a global project using Landsat. So I sort of just made things a little bit easier for me by just using something that I was already kind of expert at.
Great. Thank you so much, Anna, and well done.
Thank you.
Good luck in your future endeavors going to grad school.
Thank you, everyone, for watching, and thank you for the questions.
And there are some other questions that I'm going to email to Anna, and then she can answer them in email